News Channel 5 Network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello everyone, I'm News Channel 5's political analyst Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. The Korean Peninsula. It's one of the most important yet puzzling and not so well known challenges for American foreign policy. We fought a war there almost 70 years ago, and we still station thousands of U.S. troops in South Korea. To give us some history and background on the situation involving both North and South Korea, we welcome Professor Dr. Thomas Schwartz from Vanderbilt University. He's a history and political science professor at the university there. Dr. Schwartz, thank you for joining us again on Inside Politics.
Thank you for having me on.
Let's begin with some history. It's been a couple of generations since the Korean War was fought between 1950 and 1953. The origins of a divided Korean peninsula actually grew out of the final days of World War II.
Yes, Korea was a Japanese colony. The Japanese had seized it at the end of the 19th century. As a result, the idea was that Korea would be liberated then after the war. Japan surrendered suddenly after the atomic bombs, and the United States and the Soviet Union, who were allies at that time, made an agreement to cooperatively divide the peninsula and to move in.
And the Soviets declared war late on Japan and actually had seized quite a bit of territory, including, I think, part of Korea. Is that right?
They seized territory in the Pacific and in China, some of which they eventually gave back. But they did. They entered the war at the end of the war, right before the second atomic bomb was dropped, and consequently, then they became an ally in dividing Korea. And the United States and the Soviet Union then divided it at the 38th parallel and set up rival regimes in both areas.
And so, literally, the North Korea was set up under Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, and the South Korea was set up and backed by the United States. And it became one of the first flashpoints of the Cold War, particularly in 1950 when the North Koreans invaded. Now, was that almost inevitable given the fact that they were dividing a peninsula?
Both countries, both regimes, the South and the North, insisted that they should be reunified. And there was a great deal of rivalry between the communist leader in the North, Kim Il-sung, and the Southern Syngman Rhee, who was backed by the United States. In fact, the United States was restraining Syngman Rhee from actually any military action, so we didn't give him military hardware, whereas Stalin decided, and it's still controversial exactly why, but he decided to give Kim Il-sung the equipment, the tanks and the rest to go ahead with the invasion, and then the North Koreans did in June of 1950.
Now, we talk about the Korean War being over. Actually, it was a stalemate on the battlefield, and actually it's not over. It was only settled under an armistice, which is still in place. There's never been a peace treaty negotiated.
There's been no peace treaty, and in fact, there remains that great deal of hostility on the peninsula.
And that's why we keep so many troops over there?
That is part of it. Part of it is a reassurance to the South Korean regime, which is, of course, at the time, back in 1953, was very weak and poor, but now is one of the strongest economic powers in the world.
Now, why has the ceasefire held over? You talked about all the continuing war of words between both the North and the South, and lately between the North and the United States. Why has there not been a resumption of hostilities? Not that anybody would want that.
That's a good question. There have been many, there was border incidents in the 1950s and 60s.
The seizing of the Pueblo in 1960.
The seizing of the Pueblo by the North Koreans. The North Koreans sent an assassination squad to try to kill the South Korean president in 1968. In 1976, they killed 2 American soldiers who were in the demilitarized zone trying to prune a tree. There have been incidents, of course, between the two countries for a long period of time, but nothing has escalated, partly because of the fear of a real resumption and a full-scale war.
And both capitals of those countries are very close to each other and very close to what's called the demilitarized zone.
That's right. Seoul is very, very close to the demilitarized zone. Pyongyang is a little further away, but Seoul is so close to the demilitarized zone that it's in range of North Korean artillery, which is one of the reasons why there's a great deal of fear were there a resumption of hostilities.
One thing that has changed over time is that it began under Soviet influence, Russian influence, but over time that has become much more dominated by China. Now, in part, was that because the Chinese actually intervened into the Korean War, in fact, probably helped save that war from not being a defeat for the North?
Oh, yes. No, the Chinese intervention is what prevented North Korea from being destroyed or conquered. And so the Chinese have had a great deal of influence. During most of the Cold War, there was a sort of rivalry between China and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gave significant aid to North Korea, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, China's influence became paramount in North Korea.
Now, actually, in some ways, the Chinese becoming the more dominant influence and North Korea only continue sort of a relationship that dates back over history between the Chinese and Korea.
Yeah, Korea was in many respects within the China Empire, the Chinese Empire, as a tributary state. It derived and certainly gained a great deal of cultural meaning from its relationship with China. So there is that connection goes back a long way.
And more the battleground between China and Japan,
right.
Or today it's more, if there is one between China and the United States, it would be Korea as well. Right. We hear so much about the fact that North Korea is dominated and governed by one family since it began. So is it more like an autocratic dictatorship more than an actual communist state?
That's a good. It is more like that. I actually think sometimes it's a little bit closer to the Mafia and The Sopranos than it is to the to a real autocratic dictatorship. And certainly the types of executions and the behavior of the family in recent times, it points up almost more of a mob type of element to it. But there is an elite. The Kim family has been in charge. It has managed then to have a dynastic succession, then from the son to the grandson now of the original founder, and they are able then to consolidate control within the hierarchy of North Korea by buying off a good number of the army and other key figures.
Particularly as compared to how South Korea has developed into an economic power. The North has much abject poverty there. We hear about that, but we don't hear much about opposition from within that country. Why has there not been a move towards some sort of internal revolution in the North? Are they that good at being able to suppress their opposition?
The general view is that they've developed a very effective police state apparatus and have crushed any signs of civil society. Unlike Eastern Europe, say under the Soviets, or East Germany, which might be an interesting comparison in terms of reunification, they don't allow any forms of independent civil society. No independent labor unions, churches, social organizations. Everything is under the control of the state. The poverty in North Korea is often in the countryside. The city of Pyongyang is relatively well off and well treated. The poor people in that sense are often isolated, fragmented, and they really don't have the opportunity to organize. The absence, for example, of any internet that might allow something like the Arab Spring or consolidation of opposition. So in many ways it's very hard for North Koreans to do anything, and so what most do, disaffected people, is they flee the country.
Dr. Thomas Schwartz from Vanderbilt University, a history and political science professor, is our guest. We're talking about what's going on over in Korea, trying to put it in some historical and political perspective. Back to continue our conversation after this break.